This is Peter Chestnut. I'm a member of the Senior Lawyers Division Oral History Committee, and I'm interviewing Joseph D. Little, a member of the Mescalero Apache tribe and a member of the State Bar of New Mexico since 1977. We will learn about several dimensions of this senior lawyer, including his early life, some about his personal life, his legal career, his judicial experience, and reflections. So,
Can we start with the reflections?
cut right to it. Huh?
Right to it. Now go ahead.
No, let's build on. Let's start with your childhood. Where were you born? And when?
Oh, I was born in Mescalero, New Mexico. It's an Apache reservation in southern New Mexico, a little outside of Ruidoso. People like to say Ruidoso's next to us, so which it is. It's about a 450,000 acre reservation up in the mountains, high mountains.
And can you tell us a little about your parents, what they did for
My
occupation?
dad was a Mescalero Apache member there. My mother was from Okeowinge by Espanola, that pueblo. They met when they were in boarding school down here in Albuquerque. And in terms of, in later life, my mother was studying to be a nurse until she found my dad, or vice versa, and kind of gave up nursing and just became a housewife. So she was pretty much a housewife most of her life. Dad was what he used to call, he called himself a jack of all trades and master of none. At the school there at Albuquerque Indian School, they taught him all kinds of stuff, including, how to farm. They had a dairy farm there and the whole bit. Anyway, he learned just about everything, so he could do just about everything. Not perfect, but enough. So in terms of when I was growing up, basically what a lot of his work was logging. Actually, he ran a logging crew back then when they still had horses, and he worked logging long enough to see him where they had the tractors coming in and doing all that. I used to do some work with him on the side, but. Yeah, I did a little bit of everything. He was a logger, and then the tribe over the years developed a cattle operation. They ran about 6,000 head of Hereford cattle on the reservation there, and he was on the board of directors, and for a couple of years he had to actually manage it because the manager got sick. And so I spent a lot of summers with him running cattle out there on the range, so we did that. And then he was a heavy equipment operator as well. So his last job he really had was he was a foreman for the construction of the Inn of the Mountain Gods down at Mescalero, the original one. And most of his work was done on building the lake out there, getting that ready to go. So when he just kind of retired in his 60s, he just couldn't go on anymore physically, and that was it. He just kind of did a little bit of everything. However, I should point out, in doing that, he used to be on the council as well. In fact, he was tribal president at one time before they rearranged. It used to be like a business council, is the way the original constitution was set up. So he was like chairman of the business council prior to them changing it and making it an election process. But he was on council for several years, and actually he was judge for several years down there too. Both him and my uncle, his brother, were both judges for several years. It was kind of on the side. It wasn't like a full-time job. They were still doing their own stuff. But he had a lot of political contacts, so he knew a lot of politicians. Joe Montoya was a personal friend of his, and quite a bit. So he's the one that kind of introduced me to somewhat of the political realm, because he had to deal with all that. They went back to D.C. to work on land claims issues and all that, so he was pretty familiar with the system.
So this is Joe Montoya, the late senator from New Mexico.
Senator, yeah. He actually put him up in D.C. for about a month when they were working on their land claims. They ran out of money, so this is before we had money.
Nice. Tell us a little bit about your siblings.
I forget now. My oldest sister, she's a nun, has been a nun over 70 years. She's 89. And just gave up her activity as a nun about less than 2 years ago, about a year and a half. And when they do that, they bring them back to St. Louis. That was where she was originally, where she went to school for becoming a nun. And so she's there now. She's still alive, and we are in contact all the time. Go by and see her and everything. She was actually my first grade teacher when I started grade school. She was out working with the missions, and we were in Tularosa at the time. She was a teacher down there, so she was my first grade teacher. Then my other brother, Peter Little, he's passed since a few years ago, but he was he was in the military, Air Force, traveled quite a bit all over the world. Came back, got his degree at New Mexico State, and ended up with a master's in. No, he went over to Phoenix after he got his degree in State. Ended up at ASU and got his master's in sociology, and then moved up to Alaska with his wife to practice up there for a few years before they came back. So he ended up back here now before he passed away. My other brother, Ed Little, was, I used to call him a force of nature. He was he didn't quite, he had a scholarship to UNM football. He was quite a football star in high school, and didn't quite work out. So he was like my dad, a bit of a jack of all trades for several years. Actually, a mechanic to start with, and then he ended up working for the Ford Foundation, and he ended up traveling all over the United States and working on Indian issues, and ended up becoming very active as a kind of a manager, administrator with Indian businesses, especially the All Indian Pueblo Council, over the years before he passed away. And I've got a little sister. I forgot about that. To forget, but she's adopted. We adopted her when she was about 2 years old, and so she's known us ever since. She's in her 60s now. Raised her own family. Lives there at home. In fact, she's the one kind of holding down the fort at Mescalero. We still have our family home down there, so she's kind of the matriarch in that arena. Lots of grandkids.
Oh, nice. Tell us about your schooling, elementary school, middle school. Where did that happen?
Elementary was down at Tularosa, which is about 17 miles from Mescalero. It was a Catholic school, so that's how my sister came about. But went through Catholic school all that time through 8th grade, of course. And then one day we had a traveling priest, private salesman, I guess, came through, and they were touting the benefits of going on to the seminary if you wanted to go on to high school later. And they left forms, and didn't think much of it. So I looked into it a little bit. So I filled out the form, sent it. And by the time I was getting out of the 8th grade, I got an invitation to come out to start studying to be a priest in Santa Barbara, California. And that was where my sister's her nunnery was out of St. Louis, the Franciscans. And so this was Franciscans. That's how we get into it. But they're Franciscans, but the priesthood is out of Santa Barbara province, they call it. So I came home with that one day and told my folks that's what I was going to do. They said, no, you can't. And so glad they really accepted me. So they said, okay. So when I turned 14 and was out of grade school, me and a friend of mine boarded the bus in Alamogordo and took a ride to California. And first time either one of us had been out of the state.
So that's where you went to high school?
I went to high school 4 years in Santa Barbara, California, which is tough duty. And then 2 years of college in an area called San Luis Rey, which is just a little north of San Diego, next to Oceanside City. And a couple of years there. And then that school closed. The vocations were getting tight, so they were shutting down a lot of different places and moving them. So they were going to move that to Berkeley. I really didn't want to go to Berkeley, so applied over here and got accepted at Highland State and UNM. So since my parents accepted me to go to State because it was 90 miles from the house, I decided better do Albuquerque, be a little further. So I ended up the last 2 years undergrad at UNM.
And what year did you graduate from there?
Is it 69, 70? It's kind of a blur. I think it's 69.
Okay.
And then moved on to law school here. Applied for law school for the summer program. Got accepted and got into law school. So I'm not sure. I think it was mainly because I didn't really want to go to war during that time. The Vietnam War was on and something to do. So it was more that than anything else, I think. But yeah, so anyway, I ended up at UNM Law School.
Okay. Did you have any favorite courses or professors there at the law school?
Oh, Professor Walden, he was my favorite because he was the scariest. But, I mean, not physically. He was a very frail man, but Man, he could tear you up verbally. So I liked him a lot. But courses, yeah, I like constitutional law because it dealt a lot with tribal issues, federal law, and that kind of stuff. So I enjoyed that a lot.
How many women were in your law school class?
I thought you were going to say how many women in my life, and I had to pause there. Well, let's see. There was two, in a sense. We had what they call the summer program for Native Americans. They were trying to get us ready for law school. So we had about, I remember, 6 weeks, 8-week course, I remember, in the summertime. So in that one, we had, that was probably about half women and half men. When I actually got to UNM Law School, I couldn't tell you what the percentage is, but it's a lot less than it is now. My class alone, we might have had eight young ladies, something like that I can remember. So yeah, we didn't have a whole lot of women in law school at that time.
Okay. In your personal life, are you married?
Yep, I've been married twice. My first wife was from Isleta Pueblo, so my two sons are enrolled down there as Isleta tribal members. My current wife is from San Felipe and Taos, but she's enrolled in San Felipe. So she's got a daughter who's also enrolled in San Felipe.
And what's your spouse's occupation?
Charlotte, she actually had her own business for a while and just recently went to work for a nonprofit operation. But in that process, she ended up running for office, so she just got elected to District 68 in the western part of it's up around Rio Rancho, but it's Paradise Hills area.
To the New Mexico State Legislature?
Mm-hmm. So she's in the House of Representatives now. That's not a job, unfortunately. We'd like it to be, but we're the only state in the union that doesn't pay their legislators. So she has to keep her day job. So otherwise, she works with a nonprofit group that works with Indian voting issues and different aspects. They're doing a lot of work with energy production and stuff in the state, both in Navajo and here.
Can you tell us a little more about your children, their names, ages, occupations?
Yeah, there's Daniel. He's my oldest son, and currently he's a law officer over at Laguna Pueblo. He was a law officer over at Isleta Pueblo and then moved over to Laguna. So he's gone through the Homeland Security training and all as a federal officer because they have to be. And I think currently he's certified as for state police. He can arrest state, federal, tribal. Yeah, so he's enjoying it. I think he just signed up to do a stint back east in Quantico for about 3 months. They're preparing him to get into investigative arena on drugs and trafficking. So he's getting ready for that. And then my other son, Christopher, he's currently he's the head, he's the main court clerk for Isleta's appellate court clerk for the Isleta tribal court down in Isleta. And then my daughter, but Charlotte's daughter, my wife's daughter, from a previous marriage is Vicky. And she has 4 kids, and they live out in Iowa, of all places, but she was out there for schooling, and she's a surgical nurse.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about interests you might have outside the law?
Oh, I think all my interests are probably more outside the law. I think law I took up more. I viewed it as a vehicle. I didn't tell you, but when I came back from California and got into UNM, it was at the height of the Indian movement here in the late 60s. So I got involved with a lot of on-campus issues with the Kiva Club and others, and we helped start the Native American programs there and all. So I was very active in Indian issues, not just here locally, but around. And law, I thought, was going to be more of a vehicle to kind of continue that and working with tribes in that arena, which it turned out to be. My interest, it's hard you can't really disassociate it because everything I've pretty much done in my life that's been interesting, and everything has been, is revolved around some portion of the legal profession. I've done others than just be a lawyer, but a lot of that's intertwined, so I can't really separate it. I do have things I like on the side, like golf and all, but that's just keep you busy.
Well, so is golf one of your hobbies or athletic interests?
Was till I'm getting older now. It's a little harder to do that, so I'll have to find something else to do. But no, I played a lot of basketball and everything. It was, but as you get a little older, you have to readjust. So you watch it a lot more than play it anymore.
Right. Have you had any health or other challenges in your life?
No, I've actually been fairly healthy. A couple of operations, but nothing major. My knee, a few other things. I did a lot of, like I say, basketball, a lot of other stuff. Major illnesses? No, not to date. So we'll see. I'm sure that's coming down the line, but not at this point.
No rush there. Right?
No rush at all.
Well, let's turn to your legal career. Where did you begin your law practice?
Actually, I began it with some strange attorneys, Peter Chestnut being one of them, and Stan Reed and at that time, his ex-wife, Betty Reed. I'd known Peter, well, I'd known you through, I was working with the All Union Public Counsel at the time, and you had done some work with him. So after I passed the bar, really didn't have anything in mind, and you and Stan kindly offered up an empty office you had over there if I wanted to move in and see what I could do. So that's how I started. I think we were down in Roma.
Yes.
We had an office space down in Roma, and I did that for a couple of years. Whoever walked in the door, that type of thing. Yeah.
And then what was the next step in your career?
Well, I did that for a couple of years. You guys grudgingly helping me along, showing me the ropes, if you would. And then, since I had done some work with the All Indian Pueblo Council, they asked me to do some legal work for them. So I went over there as a general counsel after several years, and then I ended up picking up other clients. So I had San Alfonso was another Pueblo. It was my client, Pewaukee Pueblo, Nambe. So I had 3 Pueblo clients along with the All Indian Pueblo Council, and just kind of moved into that Indian arena, if you will. I wasn't dealing with individual clients after about 3 or 4 years, I guess, of practice, yeah.
And so how long did you stay with your individual practice, and what happened next?
Actually, I went to work for the Nordhaus firm for a couple of years, and didn't turn out to be a good fit, and went back into private practice. And in terms of years, I'm not sure. Maybe about 6 years along that line, and then I was appointed the director of the Office of Indian Affairs for the state of New Mexico by Tony Anaya. When it really wasn't a secretarial position, but they were trying to expand on it. And I'd applied for it because I thought it's something to do on the side, one of those things. And in those days, the tribal leaders were the ones that made the choice, and then they would recommend it to the governor. And so I actually got interviewed by literally like 22 tribes in the state of New Mexico, because at that time that's what we had. And ended up getting appointed, recommended and then appointed by Tony Naya. So I worked with them as a director for Office of Indian Affairs for about 3 years, maybe. And then I had a friend approach me who was working out of DC and said, would you apply for a position out here working with the Department of Interior? And I wasn't crazy about it, but I thought I'd try it on a whim again, so did that and got accepted. So ended up going back to Washington, D.C. back in, early 80s. I'm not even sure when. Early 80s, I think. As a Fed, I oversaw the tribal court systems nationally. We had about 134 courts we actually directly funded and provided training to, and then there's numerous other tribal courts, but since they fund themselves, we don't get directly involved with them. But we did in the way of training. I had big contracts out there that provided training to tribal judges throughout the United States. So I did a lot of traveling with them and worked with the trainers and all that kind of stuff. Did that for quite a few years. I was back there about 7 years. In that process, though, I ended up moving to another department, worked with tribal governments directly, tribal government services. So got to learn about a lot of how tribal operations are done, all that kind of stuff. Came back to Albuquerque, and mainly because I was going through a divorce at the time, and boys came back here, so I didn't want to leave them. So I came on back to Albuquerque, and they got a job as what they call the water rights manager. I was in a weird spot at that time because they normally would have engineers working on water issues for Bureau of Indian Affairs. But we were going through that period of time when they were trying to encourage tribes to negotiate out their water settlements, and we had a lot of lawsuits going on at the time. So they wanted an attorney instead to manage the program, and I oversaw a bunch of engineers. So I ended up with a job here in Albuquerque, overseeing this whole region, which included not just water cases. We had several going at the time: Lamont, Jemez, Taos, quite a few, and also the irrigation projects on the res and the safety of dams program. And I had several engineers working for me that did all that. And then we had an arrangement with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and there was a U.S. Attorney there named what was his name? Herb Becker at the time, who was a water rights specialist, and we had arrangements with them so that as we negotiated and litigated these cases, he would do that from the U.S. Attorney side, and I would do it from the Fed side in terms of providing contract monies and staff to do the engineering work to back up the cases. So basically I was doing water rights cases back then. And then even though I was in New Mexico, they had me doing, nationally I was doing all the water rights cases for a while. So oversaw those as well until they got in somebody to take it over and run that a little bit out of DC. So so I was doing that, and then I ended up, while I was there doing that, our regional director, that's the director that oversees the whole region. There's 12 of them throughout the United States with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they're the ones that directly with all the tribes in their region. So our region here in Albuquerque included Navajo, well, part of Navajo, the 19 tribes, the 2 Apache tribes, and 2 Ute tribes in Colorado. And so when he left, he put me in acting, so I did that for almost 2 years as acting regional director. And then they were on the verge of hiring me or making it permanent. But while they were doing that, I got approached by the Pueblo of Pewaukee, who had been one of my older clients, and asked if I wanted to come back to work for them because we had just got through getting the compact signed the first time. And,
gaming compact?
Yeah, the gaming compact signed the first time. And they were looking for an attorney to help them develop whatever they wanted to develop based on the gaming operation. And I kind of balked, but I thought, might be interesting. When else are you going to do something like this? So I quit the bureau and went worked for them as their general counsel. And about 3 months after I left, or started with them, of course, tribes got sued and the case went out the window, and instead of working on their projects, we ended up spending the next 4 or 5 years in court and legislature getting the compacts done. So that was quite an adventure in itself. And I left them just about the time we were getting ready to build Buffalo Thunder. Was with them while we got through the Lamont case. And well, it's interesting because on Lamont, I was on the federal team when I was on the other side with the feds. I chaired the federal team that oversaw the Lamont case. And then when I left them, came back, I was general counsel for Pewaukee against the feds on the same case. Those things take forever, so that's kind of how you get around it. But yeah, I ended up with them, and then after I left, after we got the gaming in place, the compact's finally done and all, Pewaukee actually didn't want to sign the compact. They refused. And I kind of had a little problem with that because that means you don't be able to work with the banks to get the money to come in and all that. And they preferred to duke it out with the state for the next few years. And at the time, I really don't want to be litigating this all over again. So find some other attorneys. I think I'll go do something else. So I got approached by the feds at that time to work with what they called the trust department. It wasn't BIA or what's it within Interior, but it's the Office of Special Trustee. At that time, there was a big lawsuit going on with the Cabell case, in which the tribes were not tribes, individuals were suing federal government for mismanaging their records over the years. So it was a huge, huge lawsuit. And then the tribes jumped in and they sued them on top of the individual tribal members. So they asked me to come in to work with them on their records, and it's one of those things where it's like, I don't know anything about records, I don't want to do records. No. We want you to kind of oversight how we use the records in terms of the litigation. So we need an attorney that can understand what the attorneys are looking for on the other side, both the feds and the state, as well as secure them. So I ended up doing that job for several years throughout the old Cabell case as it was going, and about 6 years, something like that. Here in Albuquerque, but we worked out of offices all over the place. But so I ended up being responsible for hundreds of thousands of records that were had to be reviewed by the U.S. and tribes, and we had to store them because at that point they were out in the field and they wanted to bring them all back into a centralized place so we could protect them and we wouldn't get into these lawsuits anymore. So I worked with the feds out of Lawrence, Kansas area, or near Lawrence, Kansas, where we built a whole new repository. We called it the American Indian Repository, and it was in the limestone caves that they were in Missouri, and we put offices under there, 60 feet underground, built-in offices, and had it set through NARA, the National Records Association, that managed it, and we moved about 300,000 boxes of records to that point, and we had to have them digitized and everything before we got them there, and then we set up the whole operation. So went through all that, and when I got that done, then I thought, I think I'll go do something else. So they wanted me to go back to actually Kansas to run the program there. I didn't think I wanted to be 60 feet underground, so it's kind of like, never mind. So they said, well, we'll tell you what, you can come back to DC and we'll give you 6 months, a year to find something. We don't have a job for you. But I mean, well, you can work with us and see what you want to do. So the options I had, they were kind of, I was thinking of going back into gaming, but I wasn't that crazy about it at that point. So I went back to the court through law enforcement. They moved the court system out of one of the departments and put it under the police, which made sense because they wanted to make it like a justice department, you know, a little bit of everything. So I literally developed a program for that and got the funding and all that, and we set up another court operation to work with the tribal courts. It was much bigger. I had staff this time and everything. And we did a lot of policy work with the court systems nationally. We were going through the Tribal Law and Order Act during that time. So we had to interface with all these different operations. So I enjoyed that a lot. And then I was operating here out of Albuquerque. They allowed me to have an office here, but it was nationally based. And then as usual, you get another administration coming in, and their bright idea was, let's move everybody back to DC. And I said, no, I want to move back to DC again. So I basically left the bureau, went back into private practice, and that's kind of ended up with these judgeships down the line as part of private practice. So.
So are there any particular highlights from your federal service that you want to elaborate on? That's been a remarkable path you've had so far.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I think I worked on the Little Colorado water lawsuit between the Hopis and the Navajos and later the Paiutes. And that was just interesting as heck because you had to work with these people, these two tribes that hated each other. And then also with the Salt River Project, which is a big power company out of Arizona that owns just about everything, and a bunch of farmers, ranchers, all that was involved. So I chaired that federal team while I was doing that case, and I really enjoyed that. It was quite challenging on a regular basis. I left him before they finally got a settlement, but that's not unusual. It takes forever to get a lot of this stuff done. Enjoyed working. I was the chair for the Mont team. Enjoyed working on that, as well as fighting with the state on the other side later. The records issue with the trust was, I think, really interesting in itself, because there was a lot of technical work that went into it. There was a lot of like having to build the facility itself too. I helped with the design on a lot of that. Worked with different federal agencies to get all that done and coordinated. And then just getting the records out to that location without losing anything. I think we lost one truck one day, and that was about it, out of all those thousands of trucks. And it was kind of an interesting story. The guy was taking drugs, I guess, and he got picked up, and so they took the truck and put it somewhere else. So we had a whole day trying to find the trigger truck with all the records in it. We didn't know where they were, and the guy was no help. So we finally found it, and we were able to get them back over to where they were supposed to be. But there was a lot of those kind of incidents as you go through. And with the feds, it was, because when I worked with the court system as well as the tribal governmental system, your role is you got to go out in the field all the time. So I was all over Alaska, California, all the Oklahoma tribes, Montana tribes. So I know pretty much of Indian country. Just being able to get out there and seeing what was going on and how they I can't say operated, but how they survived really. In lieu of the federal government was pretty amazing. So the only place I didn't get to was on the East Coast. We had tribes on the East Coast, but for some reason I didn't interact with them too much. Did some Louisiana, Biloxi, those areas, but not the Iroquois and those others up on the other side. No, for whatever reason I didn't make it to that area. But I've gone through many reservations, many council meetings, many Indian bars, whatever. I mean, it was an adventure all the way through, so it's kind of hard. That's why I said it's kind of hard to separate. When you said, you know, in the legal profession and what you liked, I mean, every day was an adventure because you didn't know where you were going to end up, especially if I hadn't been there before. And most of my time was spent on the road driving to get out to these reservations because they're way out in the mountains. I mean, some are close, some aren't, but I mean, storms and weather, bad weather, whatever, you get out there. So there was always an adventure of some kind. Missing your planes, finding planes. I mean, I went down to the Grand Canyon. We had a court down the Grand Canyon, and took a helicopter flight down the Grand Canyon to get there. And that wasn't like just the old drops off the canyon. We came from Arizona somewhere and took the whole canyon down. So that was an interesting adventure just in itself. But stuff like that would happen all the time. You just never knew. So yeah, I mean, it's always been interesting. No, like I said, there's always been an adventure somewhere down the line.
In your career, have you had the opportunity to get involved in seeking legislation?
Yeah, that was an interesting one. I had a professor, and I can't remember her name now. Very good professor, and she was actually teaching us how to draft bills for the state legislature. And I remember her calling me out on it because it was a terrible attempt I did at the time. And you know, this is just, you ain't going to be able to do any of this type of stuff. You know, just go do some other classes. Don't get into this stuff. So after I got out of law school, one of the first things I did was working with the Oregon Public Council. We had to go up and we revamped the whole law that addressed the tribal Office of Indian Affairs, and revamped that because there was some sovereignty issues in there as well as a few other things. So I actually drafted that bill and got that passed. But
Was that at the federal level or the state
no,
level?
just state level. That changed it from going. It used to be in the arts section, as the way they had it set up. We were like in one of the historical sides of the offices, and we actually moved it out, where it's a governmental entity that started dealing with the tribes on a governmental basis. So, but you had to change the law to do that. And the other was one that I really got involved in, I forgot, was the intergovernmental acts with the tribes to get jurisdiction for the tribal courts. Well, it used to be that there was no way that we had a concurrent jurisdiction or any kind of jurisdiction. The tribes had jurisdiction over their members within the reservation. That was it. the state would not recognize any arrest of non-Indians, or vice versa, we couldn't arrest non-Indians coming in. So we worked on a bill that allowed for kind of joint jurisdiction between the two, so that we could get the officers certified and they could make arrests of non-Indians. Then they went to state court and vice versa. If you got a tribal member within the tribe, you sent them over to tribal court. And that took a couple of years to get that legislation done. And now it's kind of a model. Almost all the other states do something along that line, that we can do that now. So.
Are there any particular colleagues that you'd like to be remembered in this interview?
Well, my two former buddies, of course, yourself, Peter, you guys, you and Stan Reed was the other, really got me into it. In fact, we had I think with the Pueblo San Alfonso, we went in as partners together on that. Mm-hmm. We actually, the three of us actually did that for a while as a group with the tribe. Other colleagues, Herb Becker, the U.S. Attorney, did a lot of work with him. I mean, he didn't graduate from here, but the other locals from here, there was Phil Lujan, who he was in this. He went to school here, I think, but he graduated. I think he finished out in Oklahoma. He's a tribal judge, been that way for ages. Kiowa, I think he was, yeah. But other than that, I try to usually avoid most attorneys.
Well, then let's pivot to your involvement with the judiciary.
Well, it's been interesting. As I pointed out, I kind of worked at it from afar when I was overseeing the programs of the judges. And I remember over the years they were always asking me, well, aren't you going to be a judge? And I was like, nah, I'll never be a judge. I'd rather watch you guys do it, and tell you how to do it, but I'm not going to do it. And I always thought that was interesting, even after I retired from the feds, was, well, you were always telling them what to do as a judge, but you weren't a judge anyway, but what the heck. So when I was sitting out that last time I retired, I'd applied for a position down in Isleta for a general counsel, actually, and didn't get it, but they called me back and said, well, we don't want you for general counsel, but would you consider being a judge? And I thought, well, at first, no. I've never been a judge. I don't really. And then I thought, well, here's a chance to see. I mean, I know what it's about. I've supposedly trained people on this, and even worked with a judicial college in Reno, Nevada, for the national judges, and thought, maybe try it. So I took up judgeship in Isleta, and about 4 years. It changes with administrations. And really enjoyed it. I was surprised. It was a court of general jurisdiction, so we dealt with everything from divorces to attempted murders to you name it, drug cases. We had the whole range, which I enjoyed a lot. And then after change of administration, I was sitting out for a few months, and got a call from Mescalero. They said, well, our chief judge has gone since you're from here. Any interest in at least coming down, take a look at it? So I said, yeah. So I went down there. Ended up staying there about 2 years as their chief judge, and had about 4 judges under me. They had quite a few associates, and it is quite a big operation actually compared to where I came from, Isleta, and kind of started the whole thing up. And that was pretty interesting. I enjoyed it. I think one of the things I remember out of there is that our detention facility is down in Carrizozo, which is about a 30-minute drive from Mescalero. So every time we had arraignments, we'd have to have the police go all the way down there, bring them all the way back and forth. It was a real pain. So I was looking at the state court systems, and that's about the time they were going into videotaping their arraignments. And I was wondering, well, why can't we do that? And they said, well, I don't know if you can, so go talk to somebody with the state. So I went up to the state and found out they have this elaborate process with this committee that goes through all this, and you just don't go in and say, let me do me a video for the arraignments. And they didn't want to at first, because they said it would set a precedent, and they didn't want to have a whole bunch of tribes coming in and trying to get video arraignments. And I said, well, look, how about if we try it as a pilot project? And there was cost involved, that was part of it. They didn't mind us using their equipment there at the jail, but they didn't want to pay for the transmission costs and all that. So it just happened that Mescalero was well advanced in internet service, and they have their own system down there. And we were able to tie into it near Ruidoso, and we spent the money to run the lines and got a little extra. And we tied in with that. I never got to use it before I left, but I found out later that they use it all the time now, and it's quite a savings to the police down there, and not have to go through all that process anymore. And then after that, I had one of the other judges up north approach me on how we did it, or how I did it, and said, well, actually it was private, so I don't know if they're going to do it anyplace else anymore. But I told him what the process was, and he went through the process, and I think Santa Clara now has video arraignments on theirs. So it's something you can do. The state's not jumping on it because, again, it's costly, and they have to handle some of the costs. And so even though it's their facilities, we usually put our detainees in. And the tribes aren't really set up at this point, though recently that's changed. We've got internet service all the way from Santa Fe down all the way to Isleta now, and going west all the way up to Jemez. And when I was attorney for Zia, I was involved in getting that line put in there, and getting getting the internet service out there now. So most tribes are set up for that now. They wanted to go that route. So. Anyway, in terms of just judging, after Mescalero, then I came over here. Came back. My wife was in school at the time, getting her degree. And so that made it easy for me to stay at Mescalero while we were doing that, or to stay away anyway. Once she got her degree, it was like, better come home. So got an offer at Zia, so went out there and became the judge there for about 3 years until they moved me up as their general counsel. Then I wasn't judging anymore. So that was the last thing I had there, but enjoyed it a lot.
Well, maybe this is the time to think about reflections. Can you share some reflections about tribal courts and your insights based on your experience that might be of interest to members of the bar?
Well, since I started with it back in late 70s and 80s when I went back to DC to work with it, generally in those days the court systems were kind of, I wouldn't say looked down on, but they weren't given a lot of respect from non-Indian court systems, and even the tribes themselves were hesitant to give them the gravitas they needed to do on these things. They used to make them part of the social programs and kind of like that. And they just really, we didn't have law-trained judges out there. It was just like the old JPs here in New Mexico. It used to be, be anybody, just get in there and do it. And that was part of what I worked on, is trying to build up their credibility and have the ability to do that. Part of it's money, and we had to get them more money. Part of it's just training. And even the judges that we had that weren't law trained, we at least got them quite a bit of training so that they could function in those situations. And then over the years, we started getting more young lawyers going into that. And so we right now, there's almost every tribal court system has either a law-trained judge or an attorney judge in those positions. So that's been a big change over the years. One of the big things we had was that we couldn't get comedy very easily because most of the state courts just didn't believe us. They said, you just deal with little cases. We don't want to deal with any of that. So at some point, the state actually set up a tribal state judges consortium, which is actually under state law. And they have a board, and the tribal judges and the state judges get together, and they meet regularly, about every quarter, I think, but interact, and they work on potential legislation. They've done that with the Indian Child Welfare Act and a few other things. But what came out of that is that we've established huge aspects of comedy between the tribal courts and the state courts, in this state anyway. And I don't know of any state court that will turn down a tribal ruling. In the old days, I remember even when I was at Isleta, they turned down a probate because it was on the wrong letterhead. They didn't buy the letterhead. It was like chose a tribal government. That's not true, you know, that type of stuff. A lot of our problems were actually with the judges. They were actually with the clerks, because the clerks wouldn't take our paperwork. It didn't look like theirs, so we had to work with the judges on that, so that just because it doesn't look like a state document doesn't make it a non-document, if you will. And so that's had a huge impact, I think, within tribal communities in terms of taking more seriously how courts operate and the rulings they give and what's involved in that. And it's also given a big insight into state courts to be able to deal with that and give us that comedy. And like I said, we're courts of general jurisdiction, so we deal with everything. I mean, even a lot of, attempted murders aren't anything, because the feds don't necessarily pick them up. They want a secure case, and if they're not going to win, they don't touch it. So you used to have gaps where the feds wouldn't pick it up and the state couldn't get involved, but the tribe didn't have the wherewithal to handle a case like that. But most of them do now, and they have no problem dealing with those cases. Most of our detention centers, they'll accept them because they're considered full-blown cases. In the old days, even the jails wouldn't receive you. They'd say, "Oh, you're set by tribal court. We don't take you." So we used to have to go through that battle just to get that done. So it's come a long ways, and then now you've got the cherry on top of it was, but never quite got that way, I don't think yet. But Tribal Law and Order Act, when I was back in D.C., we got that through, and that something that happened that all us judges, tribal judges, never thought would happen, is that it overruled portions of the Oliphant case. And under the Oliphant case, tribes could not arrest a non-Indian for committing a criminal action on the reservation. It had to be by the feds, and they'd have no court jurisdiction over that individual. It would either go to the feds or the state if the state wanted it. And we just thought that probably never would change. It was so odd, but it was so ingrained that, you're a non-Indian, so you can't be tried in a tribal court. That's just unfair. You're not going to be treated fairly. That was the whole issue. And part of the provisions in the act said, yeah, you can now. You can arrest somebody non-Indian for criminal. It's limited, has to be in terms of domestic violence issue, and you have to have a court that is set up in a certain way. Kind of interesting to me too is that it still wasn't good enough. The tribal court wasn't good enough to just handle the case. You had to make sure you had a public defender, that your judge was law trained, that I don't remember there was about 4 arenas that you had to meet, or you had to be able to do a jury trial, which isn't easy on a res. I've done them, but they're not easy. And then I forgot what the other one was. Maybe an appellate. I think you had to have an appellate system, and you had to have codes that were on the internet. I'm not sure why. Nobody else required that from a state court, but we had to have them on the internet. So not too many tribes originally. Let's see, the act was passed back when in the 2002, somewhere around there. And a lot of tribal courts didn't jump on it because they weren't set up to even do that. So maybe 3 or 4 started out. And now I understand there's quite a few that are in that position and have tried cases for domestic violence involving non-Indians. And the sentencing's change in that. Under federal restrictions, tribal courts can only sentence somebody up to 1 year no matter what the crime is. So, for instance, you get an attempted murder, you still do it 1 year. Of course, some tribes have stacked them, and sometimes it works depending on the district. The federal district, some will allow for stacking, some don't. But anyway, the act also allowed you to go up to sentencing up to 9 years rather than the 1 year for charges now. So that's a big jump. So basically, I've watched the tribal court systems develop from we used to call it kind of a social services operation to well-run. I wouldn't say sophisticated. That's not right. Well-run, functioning tribal court systems that can handle just about anything that comes their way. And to me, that's important. I think because one of the things missing with the tribal court systems, there's a lot of talk about the traditional law, but nobody's kind of defined what that is. And it's so nebulous to say traditional because, does the judge have to know what the traditions are, that kind of thing. So I kind of look at it more as you're setting common law because when you, even in a tribal court, you use common law, but it's a lot of English common law. Like, you know, how does that apply? So I'd like to have tribes take their traditional aspects and rule in the courts and come up with more written opinions that reflect common law from a tribe standpoint. I think we're getting to that point. We're seeing a lot more written opinions. I mean, there's published written opinion, tribal court opinions now that they didn't have in the past. So it's been able to watch it develop almost light years, if you will, because we're so far behind when we started in terms of even having a system that would address these kind of issues. And now you got it all the way. They have a National Tribal Judges Association that has jumped in on some of the federal legislation and stuff. So yeah, it's come a long way, and I've enjoyed that aspect of it. Just we can take care of ourselves now.
Can you tell us a little bit about the evolution or the presence of lawyers in tribal court through the years?
Well, it was kind of a haphazard. I'm not sure really how, we've never done studies on it, and I'm not sure how that came about. I know when I first started, we rarely had tribal lawyers taking on a judgeship. Part of it was money. I mean, I remember judges used to make, what, a couple of $20,000 a year or something. It was just, I mean, it was worse than state judges. I know state judges didn't make that money that much to begin with either. So a lot of the younger lawyers were, you know, going into other law practices and stuff. And then over the years, the money that was part of it, was the increase. The other is that I think a lot of these young judges just, or young attorneys, just weren't that crazy about going to work for the corporate world, and had limitations working with the federal world, you know, in terms of what they could do. And there's only one NARF, you can only hire so many Indian attorneys. So, Native American Rights Fund. So I think they just, there were opportunities there, and these younger ones stepped into them, and they seemed to like it. I've talked to quite a few that I didn't think would become judges. They were a lot younger than me coming out of law school. But they said, you know, we like the hours. It's not like we're slaving over a desk in a law practice. We can set our own hours and go golf a little bit if I want to and come back, deal with that. And they make enough money to get by on. So it's in that kind of an evolution. Don't know, you know, where it's going to go, but I don't think there was any plan. It just kind of haphazard opportunities arose, and the young ones start stepping into those slots, if you will.
What can you say about the presence of lawyers representing clients in tribal court?
I think it's been interesting. I know some tribal courts, when they first started, wouldn't allow outside counsel in. And under the 68 Indian Civil Rights Act, you don't have to. You don't have to provide counsel. That's why you don't have public defenders in many tribal courts. And then outside attorneys, they could just bar them and not let them come in at all. But that's changed a lot. I noticed in Sleta, we always let them in anyway, just to see. But I think we had law-trained judges anyway to begin with, so it wasn't that bad. But I like it, and I think they do good representation. The attorneys I've seen in this state anyway that come in just, you know, have the same respect as an outside court system and deal with it that way. They don't deal with it any other way. So the more you have of that going on, I think the better. It allows the individual client, if you will, to at least have a chance on getting represented, not equally, but just represented in general. And of course, if they get bad lawyers, that's their problem.
Have you seen more clients being represented by lawyers over the years?
Yeah, quite a bit more. And that, again, part of that is you got young Indian attorneys coming in to represent those people. So that's been a little bit of part of it as well. But yeah, you see more of it. You have to remember that the stakes aren't quite as high. Like I say, if you're not running the risk of going to jail for 20 years in a tribal court system, then, you know, spending the money on an attorney to defend you on that may not be worth it. A lot of the small stuff, probate, those kind of things, it's probably better handled internally than bringing an attorney to deal with it. So there's not a whole lot of cases where you will, divorces or some child support, those kind of issues. Those are pretty standard, or criminal cases that aren't that bad, but, you know, DUIs, those kind of things. Yeah, they're bringing outside attorneys for that.
So, do you have some thoughts you'd like to share about how the legal practice or the legal community has changed over the course of your career?
Oh, geez. Yeah, sad to say, I don't, I think, I think a lot of attorneys have lost that perspective of being a profession. When I went in, it was such a, God, I mean, it's lucky I got in anyway, but the thought of that being a profession, and you worked for the firms and you went through the process, and years before you become a partner and all that. But the whole aspect was that you were really trained in all these areas, and they, whether it was your mentors from the attorneys that you worked with, or yourself, I think there was a lot of pride that went into doing the cases right, and getting that. Lately, when you watch, at least from what I've seen, not just locally but nationally, some of these cases that Trump's lawyers are bringing in is ridiculous. It's like, how did they even pass a bar? I mean, just having having the gall to try to bring in a case like that and try to argue it the way they do is crazy. So I've seen that way change. I think the law's gotten very specific anymore. When I was in, I could do a general practice, and the risks weren't that great if you were doing a general practice in terms of, if you got it wrong or you should have known better or whatever. But nowadays, I mean, criminal lawyer, you don't do corporate stuff. Corporate lawyer, you don't do criminal stuff. I had the experience of being able to do all that because the restrictions were, I mean, it wasn't that complicated back then. Now the arenas are so tight. I mean, they're very pigeonholed. You're either in this area or you're not. And actually, you shouldn't even try to get out of those lanes because it is really, really technical. When I was taking courses at the Judicial College in Reno, I couldn't believe how some of those judges would come in and how specific even the judges were. We had one that was a judge that only oversaw cases of corporations applying for medical licenses in a state. And that's all he did, and done it for years, and they had plenty of it to work with. And it was that specific. It was like in the years before, that had been a special master, not a judge, but the state has an actual judge operation like that does it. And he wasn't the only one. There were several in that state that were judges. That's all they did. So, yeah, the field's getting so special these days anymore. I probably would never try to go back into that kind of a general practice. I'd get lost in it, I think. So that aspect I see is kind of, I don't know if it's dangerous or not. It just is. And by doing that, I think it becomes somewhat less of a profession and just a job. And so when I talk to a lot of young attorneys coming out, they seem to be so focused on where they're going to be in terms of a job, whether it's corporate law or whatever. They're kind of looking at that. When I came out, it was such a vast tool to use on everything that we did with tribes, jurisdiction, criminal cases, whatever it was. It wasn't a job. It was a profession, and I just see it more as to a lot of these attorneys, and I may be wrong, but that's just what I see. It seems like it's more of a job than a profession to them anymore, which I think is kind of a loss. But you kind of see it with doctors as well, so I don't know. Whatever. Maybe it's just the way it goes.
Do you have any words of wisdom you'd like to give to young lawyers?
Yeah, don't go into law. No. No, young lawyers, I hope they do, if they're going to get into it, really take it seriously and dedicate their energies to it. It isn't an easy profession. I still think it's a profession. It's not an easy profession, but it has so many implications in everybody's daily lives. Everything from tax law to writing the legislation and doing all that. So you have an important gift, and they shouldn't waste it or take it lightly, and be serious about it and do a good job. Don't just kind of walk through it, that type of thing. So I think there's a lot of potential there for a lot of stuff going on that, you know, once you get into the profession, yeah, it touches so many things. It's just amazing how many things it touches. And to be incompetent in that arena and expect to do good otherwise is, I think, a big disservice to the community.
Is there any other aspect of your life or career that you'd like to share with other lawyers or the community?
Oh, just enjoy what you're doing. If I didn't enjoy, and again, I didn't end up doing. I practiced, and I was in federal court, state court, but not like some other attorney. You know, that is their profession. That's what they do, and they do it well. But whatever you're doing, you know, enjoy it. I mean, I can always say, I can truly say I've never had a bad job that I didn't like. Either they just came my way and they're the types of job that you would have an adventure in, or you figure out a way to make them an adventure, and if you can't, then you shouldn't be doing it. I mean, so don't do it for the money, that's for sure. Because you make more money out of being an attorney, that's for sure. I always used to think, you know, if I could get to a point where I could hire an attorney, then I've made it. Never got to that point, so I still have to do my own attorney work.
Right. What would you consider to be your legacy in the legal profession?
Ooh. I think the enhancement of the tribal court systems across the board, across the country. I think a lot of work on making those legitimate, not legitimate, but operations you can be proud of, and with the idea that you can do it. I mean, you don't have to copy everybody else, but you can do it your way. But set that up. I think I've had an impact there, and I think I've had an impact on water settlements. When I first started, that wasn't the route to go. It was still the litigation. And since I just really didn't want to litigate that much, I thought the settlement was a better route, and it is a better route to go. And I think I spent several years making that a priority with the Interior Department, to where that's kind of where they go now. And most tribes most tribes agree that, you know, settlement's probably the best route to get on these cases and get them done. There's a few that probably won't work. You don't have enough water to do it anyway. But yeah, so I think those two areas, I think my name's not going to show up anywhere, but I think I've had an impact in those arenas.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to have this interview, and it'll be posted eventually on the State Bar website, and you'll be joining dozens, if not hundreds, of other members of the State Bar who've told their stories and put them out there to be shared for the future. And so thank you very much for your service and for taking the time for this interview.
Sure. Thank you.